Yo, what's going on, Dragon Ballers? Welcome back to another episode of the strategy series. In today's video, we're doing the beginner's guide for how to play control. If you guys want to learn how to play aggro or mid-range, I've done those videos already. They're up on the channel. Check them out if you're interested. But I do want to say that even if you're not looking to become a control player, if you want to be an aggro or mid-range player, this video is still going to be very helpful for you, because getting in the mindset of a control player as a mid-range or aggro player, that's going to help you in those matchups in the long run. So no matter what type of player you want to be in this game, this video is going to have helpful information for you guys. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe, hit that bell so you don't miss a video. If you want to help the channel out, there are many links down in the description to do so. Firstly, if you want to get your Crossworld competitive articles or some one-on-one coaching with yours truly, check out the Gemmy app or the Patreon. If you need binders, sleeves, card storage, anything like that, check out Dex Protection. And if you want to buy or pre-order any of the cards you see in today's video, definitely use my link in the description to TCG Player. That being said, let's get started. So I want these videos to be very timeless. I want a player to look at this 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, and I want them to be able to pick up how to play control. But these are some of the popular control decks in the current format at the time of recording. So for one, we have U7 Invoker, we have Shenron, and then representing hand control, we have Green Frieza, we have Nuke Goku. We have a lot of different green decks that represent hand control. Green generally encapsulates hand control in Dragon Ball Super. So these are some of the popular control decks now, but these things we talk about, these elements we talk about, should transition well to any control deck you're playing in the future. So just keep that in mind if you're watching this video a little bit later. So the control mindset. If you're a control player, what should you be thinking about? How should you be thinking about the game? It is very specific. You know, a lot of times with aggro and with mid-range, you're playing a very interactive game. With mid-range, you're all about reacting and sometimes being proactive when the window presents itself. In aggro, you're always about being proactive, but your opponent oftentimes will have some answers to your aggression that you have to deal with. Control, you do not want your opponent to play the game whatsoever. Generally, you end up creating a very unfun situation for your opponent when your control deck is doing what it's supposed to do. But ideally, your opponent is not curving out correctly because of your actions. Your opponent is not getting closer to their win condition because you're not allowing them to do that. And you do that by dictating the pace of the game as the control deck. So by doing this, you're basically playing with permission. And what playing with permission means is, in Dragon Ball Super at least, you have counter plays, you have activate battles, you have counter attacks, you have all these different timing cards, usually extra cards, but a lot of time battle cards as well. You have these different cards that are going to halt your opponent in their tracks, whether you're preventing them from playing a battle card, sending it to the bottom of the deck like U7 Invoker has, whether you're KOing battle cards mid-battle with another card that U7 Invoker has, the Revenge, the Emperor's Death Beam, minus 30k any battle card ignoring barrier. But a lot of different control decks have the ability to do those things. You're either negating skills of things being played, preventing things from being played, removing things during battle, limiting your opponent to attacking with only one battle card per turn in the case of Hachiyak. In the case of Yellow Topo, only allowing your opponent to play one battle card per turn. So playing with permission in that way, you're making your opponent play a very specific game. If they can't play out of that, or if they can't play around that, they're going to have a very hard time. So generally, as a control deck, you want to have a slow build-up to a game-winning boss monster. So that slow build-up is going to be, you know, counterplaying your opponent, negating your opponent's attacks, playing certain battle cards that floodgate your opponent out of the game. And once you're at your correct energy total, or once you've met certain conditions, you can play your game-winning boss monster and kind of just slam it down. So that's going to look a little different for each deck. In the case of U7 Invoker, that's going to be the Apex Victory Strike, where you just pay 5. If you have the correct amount of red-blue extra cards in the drop area, your opponent basically can't activate any battle card effects. You attack them for Victory Strike, and that's pretty much it. Or in U7 Invoker, you can go the burn route, burn your opponent from anywhere like from 6 or less life down to 0 in one shot. But other decks that could look like Smoke Dragon, that could look like Fu Shrouded, that could look like Cell Xeno. There are a lot of these big boss monsters that they don't automatically win the game when they're played. They don't say, you know, win the game when you play them, but they have such powerful effects. And that's one of the things that Bandai kind of changed with their design philosophy. That's why they banned Gogeta Hero Revived, because they don't want these cards that win the game on the spot, but control decks will generally play for these big boss monsters that give them an incredible edge. And answers to those boss monsters we will talk about in this video, so stay tuned for that. But the last thing here in the control mindset, you don't make a ton of actions per turn, but you need to have a lot of format knowledge. So the thing with a control deck, you're not an aggro deck, you're not a mid-range deck that has the potential to pivot to aggro, you're not making a ton of plays per turn, you're not doing a lot of flashy things per se. You might only be doing like 1 or 2 things per turn, but playing a control deck successfully requires you to know just what every other relevant deck in the format does. Because if you're playing with counterplays, if you're playing with activate battles, if you're playing with arrivals, counterattacks, things like that, you need to know when to use those forms of interruption. If you end up using a form of interruption on an irrelevant card, or on a card your opponent's trying to bait you with, then they're going to get their actual intended play off, and you're going to be in a much worse position for that. So knowing what the other decks in the format do kind of makes up for the fact that you don't necessarily have to do a ton of things with this deck. You don't have to, master a combo or master a form of aggression. You just have to know how to respond to what your opponent's trying to do. You're basically a very responsive deck until you meet your win condition as a control player. So the matchup spread, let's talk about it. So as a control deck, you're going to have a relatively low success rate against aggro that can vary. I like this example of Sin Shenron because Sin Shenron does actually struggle against early aggro. They do have Flying Nimbus to help out with that. They do have the Zamasu super combo to help out with that. But if you take way too much damage early on before you can get your Makikabora on board, and if your opponent kind of remove your 9-drop revenge blocker, that can hurt quite a bit. So, getting to that point as Sin Shenron where you can stabilize and hopefully not take too much damage, that's going to be pretty important. So hyper aggressive can be rough for control. Same thing with Invoker. Invoker is such a tight deck in terms of space. You don't really want to play more than 50 cards because you have to see a lot of specific cards early, but you do now have to play Topo because there's a lot of good aggro decks in the format, and U7 Invoker kind of has to be able to stave off that aggro in some way, shape, or form. Mid-range, you're generally going to have a high success rate against them because they don't always have the way to be aggressive against you. And that's one of the things with control as well. If your opponent's deck has a low number of actions per turn, if they can only drop like 1 to 2 battle cards per turn, unlike aggro that can usually drop like 3 or more battle cards per turn, especially in the early turns of the game, and you're playing with permission as a control deck, you're generally gonna have a pretty good time stopping their plays turn after turn after turn. Now, if that mid-range deck can pivot to aggro, like yellow for example, if they can go into Raider's Warcry, which is basically a turn 2 20k double striker, that can give you a rough time. So it kind of depends on what the mid-range deck is, but for the most part, you should have a pretty high success rate as a control deck. Against combo decks, we don't really see a ton of these in Dragon Ball, but we have things like Agents of Destruction with the Boo Secret Rare, a few other combo decks like that. Even Invoker is kind of a combo deck as well as a control deck because you're getting to that Rival Seeker, trying to combo off with your Catastrophic Blows and your 6-drop Goku. So that is kind of what I mean by that. And against combo, it really depends what answer cards you have, even though you'll generally have a positive matchup against combo because oftentimes you will have the right answers. But in the case of Sin Shenron actually versus Invoker, you don't actually have many great answers to Rival Seeker. You don't have like a Denial of Hope counterplay. You don't have a Preemptive Strike counterplay. You don't have the best cards in terms of stopping Rival Seeker. You have pretty decent answers to Victory Strike in terms of negates and Vegeta's Final Flash, but you don't have the best ways to stop that combo of Rival Seeker going into the 6-drop Goku to burn you for game. So keeping that in mind, that's something you'll want to think about. The Control Mirror is very slow pace. It's sometimes very boring, so it comes down to who gets their game ender first. If Sin Shenron is generally win the game on turn 6 with its activate main on the backside, its ultimate if you will, but you said Invoker can end the game on turn 5 with Victory Strike, well, Invoker is probably going to have that advantage in that matchup. The other question is though, can you answer your opponent's game ender? That's kind of what we just talked about. If you're playing Sin against Invoker, you can deal with Victory Strike relatively easily, but the burn combo is going to be a lot more difficult to deal with. And then the other thing is the potential to pivot to aggro. So maybe one way that Sin Shenron could improve its matchup against Invoker is potentially by sideboarding 4 copies of Bardock Raider's Warcry, which I talked about before, a 2-drop 20k double striker that yellow can play no matter what kind of deck you're playing. That can be very advantageous for Sin Shenron in order to kind of improve that matchup. So not every control deck can pivot to aggro, but one like Sin Shenron kind of can. So moving along, how do you control the game? Well, if you're hand control, it's going to be in a very specific way. Hand control doesn't necessarily play with permission. You can. There are pretty good counterplays in green. You have the Frieza Charismatic Villain, pop any 7-drop or less. You have Preemptive Strike, stopping the play of any 4-drop or less. You can play those cards, but generally you want to utilize your hand control cards to get the most value. The main example being Ribrianne Punishing Passion. You may combo this card, so you may spend 1 card, but that's going to rip 2 cards from your opponent's hand. So getting that value there is pretty key. Generally in hand control, you don't want to give your opponent free life. Now the front side of this Frieza leader, for example, you have to attack your opponent's leader, and then you sacrifice a Frieza army card, and then you make your opponent discard a card. So in that sense, you are giving them a life, but you're also ripping a card at the same time. Now on the backside of the leader, for example, you want to spend time attacking battle cards as much as you can for 2 reasons. One, you're not giving them that life anymore, so they can't recoup off the hand destruction you're dealing to them. And 2, you're keeping their board clear. So what a lot of high level players might do against hand control is they'll invest a lot into their board so that their hand, at least they don't feel the effects of the hand control as much. They have a board presence, they can put pressure back on you so that you spend cards. But if you can keep their board clear and keep their hand low, you're generally doing your hand control job very, very well. Now, if you're playing more of a typical control deck, you need to know which plays to stop and why. Knowing the why is very important too. Like if I don't stop the Raiders Warcry, for example, I'm going to take way too much damage, fall way too far behind in this game. And that is what we talked about before. Knowing what plays your opponent is going to make given their respective decks, and knowing how to stop that. That's very, very important. You also need to recognize when the opponent is backed into a corner. Sometimes you're going to be up against a player and they're going to be playing mid-range or aggro, and they're not going to be able to make a play because they know you have the Royal Condemnation or whatever interruption it may be that's going to stop their play. If your opponent passes turn and spends 0 energy doing anything, that's still a win for you as a control deck. That's still a win for you, because your opponent is basically in a position where they can't do anything, and your game-ending boss monsters a lot of the time aren't going to care too much about your opponent's open energy. But again, knowing what answers your opponent may have to your boss monsters is very key. And then the last thing, guys, know what potential answers the opponent has to your finisher. Basically, we just talked about this. Knowing if your opponent has the Chomp of the Trickster to your Victory Strike, knowing if they have the Mutaito to your Salzino, knowing if they have the Frost Poison to your Smoke Dragon. You need to know all these things. You need to know what colors your opponents are playing, know what potential answer cards they have, and pivot accordingly. But guys, that's gonna be all I have for today in terms of how to play control for beginners. I want to know in the comments below what you think about this video. Let me know if it helped you out. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you next time.